Hello and welcome to Movers and Shakers. I'm Ken Miller. Today I'm joined by 5th District State Senator Jeff Pittman. Jeff, thank you very much for coming by today.
Thanks, Ken, for the invite.
All right, we're recording this on July 1st. The 2021 Kansas legislative session is in the books, as you well know.
Yep.
All right, so I think we do this every year, but let's start with the budget. What did you like, not like about the priorities outlined in the upcoming budget years?
So, we put the budget in context. One of our main goals, of course, every year is to get the budget fixed for the state. And there was a lot of uncertainty when we went into this. We didn't know where the revenues were. There were projections of $700 million in the hole.
Right. COVID. Right.
Because of COVID.
Right.
We're coming out. We don't know where the returns are. There's a lot of stimulus money in the economy. And so there was a lot of uncertainty rolling into this whole budget process as we went through it. There were projections, with the Congress signing the new American Recovery Act. We said, well, okay, there's going to be some money there.
Right.
How much can we rely on that? And there were a lot of efforts early on to, it was a little bit political. There were some efforts to really cut a lot of taxes out and just rely heavily on the federal money in this year. But that seemed a little disingenuous. We should really stand on our own with what we need and project. So the efforts, there were efforts to reduce education funding and rely heavily on the federal grants for that. But that's what we did the last time we came into a recession back in 2008, 2009. The legislature ended up cutting education and relying on federal stimulus, and then that affected the whole formula that we used to go forward, and it resulted in lawsuits and everything else. And so we didn't want to get down that path. And so what I'm really pleased about when we look at our budget is that we fully funded the education. So that our schools are sustained. We're not back in that 2015, 2016 when I first got into that situation where we've cut everything down and we're not able to fund our schools. So that's a good thing. We're funding transportation to levels that we're still using it a little bit to borrow from, but we've reduced that from $1 billion down to kind of the $100 million levels per year, and that's a big thing for us locally. With us growing here locally. We're looking at K7, even 69 down in Johnson County, and looking at the overall transportation plan. We need to make sure we're funding that transportation plan. And so having those two things funded was huge. When I think about some of the things that we're doing in the budget, we're also giving some incentives out. And so we're looking at economic stimulus. We're looking at how do we use programs to make sure we're competitive as a state when we're bringing businesses as we're rebounding out of the COVID situation, having jobs available. We have something like 70,000 jobs available or coming available, and we've added, Urban Outfitters just in my district down south, added a facility that's going to be hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 new jobs in the area, and there's a whole series of investments of 20 to 40 million that are coming in the state right now. And some of that's due to the fact that we're putting incentives, structuring them into the budget for business development, and I think that's going to be key for here in Northeast Kansas. When I think about some of the things that I wish could have gotten funded a little bit better, state employees did not get officially inside of the budget the raises that I think they deserve. There's an argument to be made that they did maintain their jobs during the COVID pandemic, and they were able to do some alternate living, and there was that argument made, but still, I think it's having a regular cadence as normal employees of 1% or 2% in terms of an increase to keep up with cost of living should be an expectation. And for my local employees that are employed by the state are affected by that, that's.
Are you seeing a brain drain because of that?
I wouldn't say that. Just not on this. State employees, brain drain. I would say that it depends on the types of positions we're talking about. When we look at prison workers, correction workers, we're paying a little bit more competitive rates, but they're still not to the level where some of our employees are getting pulled over into other opportunities. Whether it's the Johnson County jail system, the federal system, or wherever. And that's the one I think about a lot. And the transportation employees, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a brain drain, but it makes it harder for us to retain talented workers.
Engineers and such.
Oh yeah. You could argue that Kansas has suffered over the last 20 years or 40, 30 years a brain drain, and some will look at that. We are seeing people come back, but we need to maintain, our higher education. We've got to maintain jobs and be competitive in the job market. we're going to make it a quality place to live for people raising their families with good education, a reasonable tax base, and I think laws that are accepting of many different types of people out there.
Okay. All right. As I mentioned, we're recording this in early July. A couple of weeks ago, the state of emergency related to the pandemic ended. Some of the other provisions ended earlier than that, including the block on evictions.
Yep.
Talk about the state's pandemic response now that it's almost come full circle since March of 2020.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stress during the last year, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
And whether you like it or not, there's lots of different opinions on this, and sometimes it got heavily political. The governor and the administration took a course of action, took some strong leadership positions, got a lot of resistance on that, but pushed through early on to give the education folks some visibility into when the closures were going to happen. What's happened now is the legislature's come back in and started re-looking at what we call KEMA, Kansas Emergency Management Act, and rewrote some of those things about how, when there's a big, when we talk about natural disasters and emergencies, we often think about localized situations, flooding, tornadoes, fires. But when something is more drastic, there weren't really laws in place to deal with that. Basically laws, but the extended nature of this, there was a lot of concern about how much a governor or administration or the legislature or a committee in the legislature could take action. And so we did do a big rewrite. And some of those are good, some of those are bad. Some of those stripped a lot of powers away from from the administration, no matter which administration comes in place next time or off in the future when this happens again. And that might cause a lot of bureaucratic headaches for whoever has to deal with something like this again.
Right.
But I get it. So what are we doing now? The COVID vaccines are rolled out. I think the state's doing really well from the numbers. Well over 50, if not 60% of the eligible 18 plus individuals have been vaccinated. I think that we're hitting up against a wall of folks who probably aren't going to get vaccinated when we look at our numbers. We have Pfizer able to get vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine down to 12 plus. So go out there and go out and get those. I encourage everyone
before school starts up. Right.
It seems as though the side effects are not bad in terms of the Pfizer vaccine at all. So I think that we can feel a lot safer about that for those who are on the fence. And I think that's huge. The more we do on that front, the better. There's a lot of talk about unemployment and whether this state, like Missouri, should have followed suit and say, hey, we're not going to have the $300 extra for unemployment for all of our individuals out there. And to be clear on that issue, if we were to stop that, it takes a month for that to go in action, and if we would have stopped it back in May, we would only had 2 months left of that program. So we're talking about 2 months of $300 extra for some workers. That is at 3 times, 300 times 4 is $1,200, $2,400 we're talking about over the course of 2 months that we would have shut out of the system. And for me, I'd rather have that money being reinvested down here in Kansas, knowing that we're in a summer months where we have extra workers for those lower paying jobs in the form of high school students who can take advantage of that. And that program's ending anyway, so it just seemed like a political stunt to me. Not going to have that much of an impact on the actual workforce and who's available. Because I do know we have folks that are complaining about not having a number of workers. It's a good situation in the sense we have more jobs available. And I think we're going to have more people coming out. We're going to have skills development to get people into the types of jobs that they're looking for. And I think the state is looking at how do we use the recovery money to increase training opportunities through workforce development and that type of thing. So I think that's good, and I think we need to keep focused on increasing capital investment in the state of Kansas to bring better jobs, higher paying jobs, a wide variety of jobs to meet the work needs of the population here. So I think that we're doing actually really well from that standpoint.
Okay.
I think we're coming out of it. Our economy is looking very strong, and we've got a lot of capital coming in here.
Well, I don't think there's an argument, not that it was doom and gloom back in March of 2020, but I think there was a heck of a lot more concern about how we were going to be faring a year and a half later,
Oh.
we've actually fared pretty well. I don't think anybody can dispute that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's been a lot of tension,
Right.
a lot of folks, and the more we can promote civil dialogue and actually look at what's happened here and come up with solutions that work for us as an American people and a Kansan people that meets the needs of both freedom and liberty, as well as how do we progress through this in the next case, and if one were to go into such a severe lockdown, what are the conditions that would actually necessitate that versus making them more subjective? That would be a good step forward, I think, in the future. But right now we're doing well.
Okay. All right, so the Kansas Department of Labor has been in the news for all the wrong reasons for a pretty long time now. And you're kind of an IT guy, so I think you have maybe a better expertise about this and being in Topeka and such. But do you think we're any closer to solving the tech and other problems that have hurt Kansans? These are people who really, and you see the TV news has stories on individuals that have been hurt by this over the last year and a half. But where are we at when it comes to improving the Department of Labor's ability to deliver their service?
Sure. I'm big on context, so if we look back at the context of how we got into this situation, we have a mainframe system in the Department of Labor. For those who are not tech savvy, that means we've got a system from the 1970s.
Right.
I don't know, some of my viewers weren't even alive in the 70s, so you think about that, and 4 decades old, and it's really good at just kind of processing things. It understands the inputs, it pushes things out, and it's really efficient at that, and it just kind of does steady state. We added on top of this during the pandemic, these federal programs,
Right.
and they tried to come in and do the modifications, but the type of folks that can do those modifications are programmers from a different era, and so they're expensive, hard to find, they do COBOL and these types of things. So we've got this old system that was slated, by the way, to be modernized back 2010, 2012 time period, but then Governor Brownback's administration came in and cut that program. Wasn't a priority for whatever reason. And so what that meant was kind of continued along, and our normal load of unemployment is not that big. Now we increase it by 20 to 100 times in terms of the number of requests coming in. It was overwhelmed and didn't have the processes and things set up, and they had a real issue. And I felt it, my colleagues in the legislature locally across the state felt it, as we became point people to help these individuals out. And I'm talking 10, 20 different requests a day from different individuals who needed some help. And the process was broken, the call centers were overwhelmed, didn't have enough people, the processes weren't set up. So it was a problem, and people were having a hard time making ends meet. Then you come November, December, the hackers, the bad actors from outside the states, inside the states, organized crime, different prison organizations. It runs a gamut of different folks that have done this. But they started using any given organization, whether it's the city of Lansing or a young sign company as an example, or any company, and just tagging names into it, randomly putting these things together and then submitting them as claims. If you do 1,000 of those things, some of them sometimes get through, especially in a process that's more manual like it was operating. So all of a sudden all these businesses were having all these fraud attempts from people that didn't work there or hadn't worked there or whatever. Terrible situation. So you had this identity fraud, you had claims fraud, you had people trying to take over, and so the state started putting in place a stringent identity protection system. Well, that caused a whole new flood of people who were legitimately trying to make claims but couldn't get in. But it did help block out those fraud attempts. And so we had to protect. I think that the state did a good job, maybe a little late, of protecting that private information in the process, so that protecting it on the front end instead of trying to diagnose all these claims on the back end. That progressed through January. The governor staffed up another double the amount of people taking calls so that there was more immediate contact. I think there was a blind spot that from a customer service perspective, some people just want to be able to talk to somebody, and sometimes it's every day. And that's the way it goes.
And mostly older folks too.
They want to know, they want to hear, and they want to know that somebody's actually helping taking care of the problems. So there's that immediate, like, how can I talk to somebody? And we still have challenges, let's face it. But the number of I might get 1 or 2 a week in terms of that are having challenges now.
Mhm.
So here we are, we're going along, people are starting, they've gotten their money, there are hiccups along the system, people are marked for fraud for different reasons, and so there's a lot of challenges with that still in terms of getting them out of that cycle. But we're also out of the period almost of all that, of the extended unemployment being in effect.
Mhm.
So a lot of people are not going to be eligible for the unemployment anymore, which is reducing the burden on the system. Meanwhile, I've been appointed, I'm on this oversight committee for the modernization of the unemployment. And what we've done over the last couple of weeks, we just started 2 weeks ago, is reviewing, I'd say, the main complaints from what we've heard and finding out where they're at now, seeing what the backlogs are, tracking metrics around how many are going through, how much, and we're doing an audit on the fraud, so we understand roughly what an estimate would be on that to understand what caused that and what we can do better in the future. And then there's an RFP being put together that we're reviewing in detail about what do we want from a user experience, from an employer experience, from a State Department experience, from an identity experience. As you look across the different touch points and all the stakeholders, what is it we would want this new system to do? And so a lot of that's been done, but we as a committee we've got some individuals from industry, some individuals from the legislature, Department of Labor involved, and we're putting our heads together saying what do we want it to look like? We've got money allocated to it, you know, to the course of tens of millions, so that we actually do this, and we've got strict deadlines in terms of when this thing isn't going to happen. They're aggressive, and we think they're going to be pushed at least, you know, half a year.
Have you reached out to other states? Maybe there's a state or two that have models that maybe Kansas can build off of?
Yep, we're looking at some states like Texas has, I think that was the basis of some of the RFP work. But make no mistake, this is happening across.
Oh, yeah.
We're in a particularly bad position because of the ancient nature of our technology that was put in place and wasn't really able to be extended out to facilitate all these different programs.
Right.
But there were a few states that were in a very similar situation, and we definitely, states are now coming to us and asking how we've dealt with, mind you, just a handful.
Right. Right.
But yeah, we definitely are looking at other states, seeing how they're dealing with it. But there's still people out there. I know somebody who might be listening and they might get angry because they have not had their issue resolved. And you know, we're trying to work through. I've gone in and looked at how we have to resolve these things, and it is very difficult for the people who are looking into, was this program the right program? Is this person actually qualified for that program? Is this person who they say they are? And we've made a lot of strides taking care of those, but there still are some stragglers out there.
All right. When you came in, I think the last time we visited was January. I think it was just after the session had started. But I asked you about a couple of issues, kind of trying to see into the crystal ball and procrastinate or prognosticate.
Prognosticate, that's
right.
Not some of it is procrastinating.
Well, and I'm going to get to sports gambling here, the prognostication. But let's start with Medicaid expansion, because I think that was talked about a lot. My understanding is we fell a little short again, but give us an update on where Medicaid expansion stands.
So Medicaid expansion, you know, there was an attempt on the Senate side to push it through. The votes are not there. They just are not there this time around. Governor was pushing for it. She had a thought that maybe she could link Medicaid expansion to, say, medical marijuana. That went over, and it didn't go over well. I don't think the people who are advocating for medical marijuana didn't want their issue tied down. Right. And by this, and just while the financing might have been there for that, a lot of people didn't like the linkage there. So, you know, when we talk about Medicaid expansion, it's talking about healthcare. We're talking about, you know, over $4 billion that we haven't taken advantage of that could have been invested in Kansas from federal subsidies. 150,000 or more Kansas affected by this. I think of it as a workforce enablement. So when we have small businesses who can't provide those healthcare options, but are still paying those lower end wages, you know, where are those people who need healthcare going to go? They can't afford a plan. It's too expensive for them, or they're not poor enough necessarily to get the true bottom income level services. So that's where that gap is that these people would fall in, and it helps businesses have that as a backbone for their workforce, as they pay the workers what they can afford to keep themselves open as they come out of this pandemic. And I think that it's unfortunate we don't have that. The American Recovery Act has put in incentives for us to then once again relook at that. Hundreds of millions of dollars per year that we can take advantage of if we were to expand, but there's just a political divide on this particular issue, and it doesn't look promising, if I'm honest with you.
As you said, the numbers just aren't there.
Right.
You mentioned medical marijuana. Let's move to that. That actually came a lot closer. I think most people
Much
thought it
closer than
might.
people would.
Yeah.
I think it was 79 votes in the House out of 125 voted for that. So clearly, that's a bipartisan majority that voted for that. It's pretty stringent in terms of the rules and regs that it's putting in place and the types and forms that the medical marijuana could take. But we're like the 47th state in terms of doing anything. We haven't done anything on this particular topic.
Right. Do you sense there's some pressure because our neighboring states have all moved to? Are you guys getting that in the legislature?
You see it. We're surrounded by somewhat
even Oklahoma,
pretty conservative states, or progressive states like Colorado who have done this in some form, found it quite successful. And we have individuals in the community who find that this is a good alternative to things like opioids, who find it works with seizures. And the folks in the legislature who might be a bit more on the conservative side, who now are big proponents, are the folks who have had some experience with a loved one who has had cancer or other situations like that, have seen it work for those individuals. And so I think it's a matter of time. You know, what happened was they passed this form in the House. It came over to the Senate. The Senate president took a procedural motion, which is not usually invoked, to push it into this committee that he knew it wouldn't come out of at the last minute. And he said it was material changed, and it was. I have no arguments. The bill was put into another bill. But if you know anything about the legislature, that happens every day of the week. And so they, we put an education bill inside of some other, and so it was true that it was material change from the way the bill was started, from what it became. But rarely do we actually invoke that thing that says, hey, because it's material changed, we're not going to let it go to a vote on the floor like it should.
Real quick, because I want to move on to a couple other things before we wrap up. But at your office, whether it's via email, people visiting, phone calls, heck, when you're in Leavenworth, Lansing, and down in Wyandotte, what are people, give me a percentage, what are people telling you when it comes to medical marijuana? Are they for it? Are they against it? What's the breakdown, just from people that you're hearing from?
It's going to be anecdotal. 60-70% are for it. Completely anecdotal. There are folks who have concerns. We've had a huge education cycle over the last half a century about how bad marijuana was and how it's a gateway. We had the war on drugs, and one can't deny that that's had an impact on the way we perceive marijuana. But people do see it as not as strong a drug, and definitely not nearly as harmful, say, even as alcohol. Not as addictive as, say, tobacco, and not as destructive as, say, meth or some of the other heroin and these types of things. And so they see the benefits, and I was surprised. When you go out and survey the veterans out there's a lot of veterans who are very much supportive of it, and there are still some that are very much against it. It wasn't allowed when they were in the military. They were brought up. It's wasn't allowed. It was illegal. So it's a mix still, but I'd say the climate, the majority see that it can happen. They see it's happening across the nation.
The tide's rising.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I've got a sports gambling question. We know that we're not sports gambling in Kansas, so we know the answer to the big question. But tell me, there were bills, there has been talk. What seems to be, because Iowa has it, you've got the East Coast and West Coast, you've got a bunch of states that have it now. What, in your estimation, seems to be the biggest block to having some sort of sports gambling in Kansas?
Really, it's I'm gonna call it there's this, we have individuals who are in leadership or in sub-leadership positions who keep tying pet issues that have been very difficult for us to solve to this particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
So much like I'd like to reduce the sales tax on food as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And people are broadly supportive of that. We have one of the highest sales tax rates on food in the country here locally. But we keep tying it to, if we're gonna do that, we're gonna give huge discounts to, say, corporations, or we're gonna do this. And it can never come out clean.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, on sports gambling, when we pushed it through and looked at the revenues, the opportunities for us in the state of Kansas to do this in different ways, it was tied to dog racing.
Mm-hmm.
It was tied to the way we do casinos now. And because of the structure of the way we've got the casinos in place now in the state of Kansas, changing those laws opens up the state of Kansas to some lawsuits by certain special interests or people who have vested interest in changing those laws, who have properties. And so it seems like whenever the people who can get this out of committee in a way that's clean, they're constantly trying to muck with this and change it around. And it just seems like there's a lot of special interests and special perspectives that we can't get through the details of that without putting some kind of a heavier issue in place for whatever reasons.
Okay, so there just doesn't seem to be a stomach for it based on what you just said, whether it's lawsuits, whether it's perceived trampling on other
Well,
people's.
if we did it clean, there's an absolute appetite.
And the revenue too, right.
It's right there. But if we keep tying things like whether we're gonna reduce the rates for slot machines in a former dog racing facility or not, if we tie that to this issue, it becomes, you might not understand this as a layperson, but those have big impacts on the state and what we're liable to. And so if we keep tying those things together, sports gambling and this, it's not gonna move forward. It's gotta be somewhat clean, whether it's tied to some kind of lottery program or apps. We can work through all those details. And actually a lot of them we'll work through. But if we keep bogging it down with this thing that's been trying to be pushed for the last 10 years, it's not gonna move forward.
Sure. Final one, and this one is, the importance can't be underestimated of this issue, but it's a little more nebulous and it's maybe harder to wrap your arms around unless you're a legislator or heavily involved in political parties. But of course, I'm talking about legislative and congressional redistricting. The census has been, I think the census has been completed. I know that the pandemic threw a lot of wrenches into that, but you're getting statistics, you're getting numbers now from the 2020 census. Talk a little bit about how the legislative and congressional redistricting is going.
Sure.
And I mean, that's going to filter down all the way to Lansing. I mean, it's not just the U.S. and state of Kansas. It's every community will be affected by redistricting.
Right. So every 10 years we do redistricting. I represent about 72,000 individuals. If the population shifts around, I get more individuals into my district. Somebody else gets less. Every 10 years, you kind of have to redo what the boundaries are, so we each have equal representation, equal voice out there. Close, it's not always exact. And so the redistricting relies heavily on the census that happens every 10 years, and then we go back and look at the lines and say, are we proportional still? Oh, we're not. So when we're not, we as a state, and it's been verified by the U.S. Supreme Court, we as a state are really the supreme power that decides how we redistrict, how we draw the lines. It doesn't go to a federal level. It stays in the state. It can't go to the Kansas Supreme Court.
And it has in the past.
It has in the past. Right. And so what happens is the House, the Senate get together, they draw maps up. And there's unfortunately a huge pressure on the majority party, whether that were Democrat or Republican, to redistrict in their favor.
Sure.
And what does that mean? It means redistrict to if we know as a majority party that the minority party has more votes in here and is always going to have that, we'll push more minority party votes into that district and pull some more majority votes into more of a swing district. There's just a huge pressure to do that. We typically call that gerrymandering, but real gerrymandering is when you actually do that and you create some wacky maps that obviously don't take communities into account and other things like that. There are redistricting committees that have been formed in the House and in the Senate. They are meeting in the interim, meaning the session's done, so now there's just interspersed committee meetings here and there, and they are looking at the numbers. I'm sure both the Republican and the Democratic Party have national committees that are helping look at different breakdowns, and that's going to happen. It's going to affect whose districts are in CD, Congressional District 3, which is Johnson County Wyandotte right now, who's in Congressional District 2, which it runs from north of Atchison all the way down to the southern border.
Right.
Our CD1, which is all of western Kansas except for that area around Wichita, and it's CD1. And it's going to affect those districts and the politics there. It's also going to affect state representatives, state senators. Who are they going to represent? And we see this, we've seen it affect us locally. It shouldn't affect it really shouldn't affect our local, nonpartisan city and school board elections. And I hope it doesn't. I hope we can keep those as nonpartisan, look at the ideas, look at the individuals, who we think represents us at those levels, and keep it very constant. But it will affect how the precincts are drawn up and the fundamental pieces. It's in its early stages. There's a lot of different maps.
Right.
You see a lot of them pushed around. You see some people who are up in arms about how this one would make it for a lot, and then another map which is more consistent with the way things are now. I would say there hasn't been any solid maps proposed by any individuals where one could get a really good idea, but there is the jockeying going on right now.
Sure. Do you, and I realize this is a guess on your part, but do we have the new lines in time for the 22 elections?
We have to.
So that's required.
Yeah.
Maybe explain a little bit more about that. What is your deadline as a state?
Oh my gosh, I think, forgive me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
I believe everything has to be in place before the declaration for office for the primary of 2022.
So June 1st of 22.
Yeah.
So a little more, or a little less than a year from now. Right?
Yeah, so the process is we need to have something together as a legislature early on. Next session is ideal. Have some maps that we vote on, go back and forth on, I'm sure. We need to put those in place in time to have any kind of contesting of that.
Right. The court's going to need time, right? Yeah.
Yeah. The court would need time, and then they would take a point of view. And there are rules that tend to guide us. We're supposed to keep communities together.
Right.
We don't want to draw precinct lines between naturally formed community blocks.
Right.
That type of thing.
And those community blocks should have about the same population.
Geographically,
Right.
we should keep it somewhat, contiguous with each other.
Right.
But we'll see. It's going to be quite the thing, quite the process to
Right.
get through.
Right.
And it's a thing that doesn't get a lot of attention each year. Everybody knows it kind of happens, but they're not sure exactly of all the details because it is a detail-oriented process, looking at how things play and how the population goes between different communities. And then there's speculation amongst those interested parties about which way they're going to vote.
Yeah.
But I'm much more for representation. Let's get the right people. Let's get the lines that look approximately right, and go for fair redistricting. I mean, that's what I'm pushing.
All right, to wrap it up, is there anything that flew under the radar maybe that we didn't hear about if we only read the newspapers and watch TV? Because you're there just about every day during the session. What's something maybe that we didn't hit on or maybe missed that you knew played a pretty big role this year?
Well, I mean, I point out some things that are going on locally that are important. You saw we had a groundbreaking at the Lansing prison the other day. What is that? It's a new innovative program that allows us to have private investors come in and help with funding workforce training, education, as well as spiritual development buildings that then the state can take advantage of and have our own folks running those programs. But it allows some of that investment where businesses really want to see an increase in the workforce, and that's a way that we can train folks with the added benefit that if we can keep them out of the system, we're saving the state money, we're making the community safer, and we're doing workforce development and reducing recidivism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big program.
Right.
Aligned with that, there's also another program where we were investing more into mental health facilities and drug addiction treatment for our prisoners. And people say, well, why are we investing so much in them? It's because we want to reduce the rate of crime.
Right.
We want to reduce recidivism. We want to take people and help them move out of that cycle that they're in. When they go back in, we want to prepare them for those first few weeks where it's so easy to fall back into that trap that got them in there in the first place. And one of those programs is the Senate Bill 123. It's a moniker for people who are charged and serving time for more serious drug crimes. We have this program for them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we expanded that program for those who are actually going on probation as well. So the circle of folks that we're impacting with that is bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a fantastic step forward, because if we're on probation, we're still inside of that risk area. And we don't want people who are on probation going back and just falling back in either.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to help them move that through that process. So that's definitely below the radar, but we've maintained the grant funding for mental health services for high school students.
Mm-hmm.
It's a grant where the local guidance centers are able to put in place counselors that are focused on mental health, not just academic counseling,
Mm-hmm.
But mental health issues to help reduce the suicide rate amongst our students. And that program we're hoping to expand it, but we'll see how it goes. I'm just glad that we're still funding that.
Sure.
Think about one of the things that's near and dear to my heart. The governor has issued a directive that we're going to be applying for a new veterans home. Large part of that was some of my efforts, some of the local other representatives' efforts, as well as some different veterans that are legislatures that started that process a couple of years ago, put some bills in place. COVID kind of stopped the whole process, but the governor saw the light and basically made it happen. So we're going to be applying for a new veterans home in Northeast Kansas that'll be 65% paid for by the federal and 35% from the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that moves forward. And the House did cut that budget down by $7 million, which takes the overall budget down by $20 million.
Mm-hmm.
But we can always re-up if we find that as we get into the future and we actually have to issue those bonds from the state level to support this. There's always an opportunity to go back and say, hey, here's what we've now applied for. How are we going to make up any gap that we see? But I'm excited by that. That's a big thing. It's going to be, the application goes out in April 2022, and we'll see how that moves through the federal VA system. And then, one of my bills that I pushed out was this VFW Rider, Patriot Guard funeral procession bill, where my uncle had passed away. He was a veteran from Vietnam, a helicopter pilot, and we went out to his funeral in Tennessee. And the Patriot Guard, we see them all around, and sometimes if you're not familiar with what they do, you can't appreciate all that they do for the families that are grieving. They helped us through navigate all the traffic, the stoplights, the highway, provide the military honors. And when I came back, I thought to myself, what can we do for these local guys? We didn't even have laws in place that recognize funeral processions. And in testimony, we found, the VFW riders, they recognize, in the country towns, people will remember to pull over and things like that. But as you get more into the city landscape, it's a lost kind of thing. And so this helps recognize that these are a thing, and that these military escorts like the VFW riders and the Patriot Guard do actually have temporary right to stop traffic and move on through the stoplights, and it gives guidance about how a funeral procession is supposed to put their flashing lights on and that type of thing. Small thing,
Right.
but it's something I was very happy about.
Sure.
Pushing that through
Right.
this year, and it's a contingency here. We've got 2 national cemeteries in the area that it affects a lot of the folks that give their time to give our heroes a place, guidance along the route to their final resting home. And then I'd say other things, gosh, let me look at, I had a couple notes here that we're under the radar. I don't know, we've covered so much.
No, we have. It was a busy session, and which the fact that you dealt with those issues that were not COVID related, it's kind of funny because you thought COVID was just going to take all the air out of the room, but you had other things you had to do.
And we knew that we had to have a future-looking kind of perspective, or at least I did. Let's look at how we were going to position, like the economic stimulus bills. How are we going to position that? How are we going to deal with any stimulus money coming in? And how are we going to make sure that we maintain solidity of the budget through that process? Make sure we have education folks thinking about remote education opportunities in the future. What do we learn from the technology aspects of that? I'll say one thing that I don't know if it's under the radar or not, but something that we need to watch. From my perspective, I know there's going to be differences of opinions, is that we need to make sure that these election laws that we're looking at locally, that we're not disenfranchising certain voters with that. And what I mean by that is the Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, a very conservative Republican, came in and said, we had a fantastic election in the state of Kansas. Audited it, can't find any areas for fraud, but there's still an effort amongst our state legislature to somehow tighten up laws, to make it harder to do advanced voting, to challenge how the mail-in ballot system has worked, even though we're not finding any issues with that. And I really think we need to be very cautious about how we proceed on that front. I'm all about election security. I want to make sure that we're not being unduly influenced, and that cyber things are not coming in and causing us issues like that. We should be more transparent on the money coming into our elections and that type of thing. But when we start looking at how we tighten up election windows and we start making it harder for those who might have two jobs and have a hard time getting to the polls about getting advanced ballots or anything like that, we better make sure that we're doing things that are necessary and are not just arbitrary political things. And so I just put that caution out there. We are a free society, we vote, and we need to protect that vote for all people that are out there.
Okay. All right, I've been speaking with 5th District State Senator Jeff Pittman. For Movers and Shakers, I'm Ken Miller.